everyone. Welcome to this BAKERpedia seminar all about tortillas and wraps. I'm Mark Flurka, your host for today. Vantage Food is one of the sponsors of this, right? And so Vantage Food is a market leader offering customized solutions, in-house research and development, and an extensive portfolio of food processing ingredients. Their offerings include release agents, emulsifiers, stabilizers, processing aids, shortenings, esters, polysorbates, antifoams, specialty ingredients, spraying equipment, and much, much more. Also, they offer a full line of clean label solutions, including allergen-free, non-GMO, organic, kosher, and halal. Ingredion turns plant materials into value-added ingredients. Plants being the ones that grow in your garden, right? In over 100 countries, they do this, making life better for brands, consumers, and the planet. Their portfolio and team of experts in clean label, reduced sugar, protein enhanced solutions can meet the challenge of delivering better for you and better tasting in every bite. So now let's get to tortillas and wraps in production. Okay, so here we are, tortillas and wraps. BAKERview brought to you by Grain Millers, Ingredion, KPM, and Vantage Food. So what we're going to do is we are first going to take a look at we gone through the introduction there, and we're going to take a look at the definition of the types of tortillas and ingredients and processing. So, what's one of the most loved current baking trends? Of course, you got it, tortillas and wraps. You can also get information on tortillas and wraps in our pocket guide. So if you use the QR code, I'll leave that up there for a moment, and we'll bring this back up at the end a little bit again too. You can use that QR code to zap yourself right over to BAKERpedia and download your very own copy of the tortilla pocket guide. You can also surf manually to www.bakerpedia.com, click on the community drop down, and then select Pocket Guides. Okay, so why do we say tortillas and wraps are so popular? Well, quite simply, in US dollars, there have been 37.7 billion dollars and a 57.7 billion growth with a compound annual growth rate of 5.4%. And they are healthier baked goods. Simply put, another way of looking at this is that we're also familiar with how common sliced white bread has always been. Tortillas has now usurped, meaning that there are more tortillas sold in the US nationally than sliced white bread. That's how much it has been growing. It is part of the definition of tortillas and wraps is that it's unleavened baked products. This is most commonly for the corn type of tortilla, as wheat flour tortillas are leavened typically with yeast, sometimes with a little bit of baking powder as well. Corn or wheat flour tortillas are what are most common. And then the dough, it is flattened into a circular shape, whether it be by pressing, sheeting and stamping. There's different ways. We'll get to that some more, right? So the types of tortillas for wraps are most commonly wheat flour tortillas. Corn tortillas are also used, gluten-free tortillas, or keto and low-carb tortillas. They're all a little bit different. Of course, gluten-free are a lot different, right? So the main ingredient is flour. Flour's function is the structure builder. It also helps provide texture to the tortilla, and it helps keep it flexible. So it's got a lot of functions in the whole process of the making of a tortilla. Other functions of other ingredients that have a function are, of course, water. These are the two main ingredients, flour and water. Hydration of the dough, water absorption into the protein, and this provides you with the texture. So through protein development or gluten development, as we call it, we create that resilient texture. So when it comes to gluten-free, that has to be adjusted because we're removing that gluten. When it comes to keto and low carb, it's also a little bit tricky because we're removing all of the starches and we could put more gluten in, but we can't just replace all the starch with gluten. It would become a tough rubbery ball. So we have to find other things that replace the starch for keto. These might be things like chia, or nut meals like almonds or things of that sort, right? Those are great in providing you additional fiber, but not the starch that you need. And so the water is the functional part in that, and that is there for absorption and processing as well. Um, Another ingredient is fat. People don't realize, but fat, even though it's a relatively small amount that is used in tortillas, is critical in processing. Because in traditional tortillas made with wheat flour, the fat lubricates the gluten to help you with the stretching, sheeting, and so on, to help make the gluten a little more malleable. It's sort of like it's adding some grease to the whole thing, right? It's also a release agent. It helps in the presses to ensure that the tortillas don't stick. And it provides flavor. It's mastication in your mouth. It provides a sense of moistness, right? And the texture, of course, it helps provide shortness so that the tortilla is not too tough. And it actually, of course, it adds to the flexibility and pliability of the tortilla because we don't eat them like big flat rounds. We are rolling them or folding them or things like that, right? So then there are, as we mentioned, there's leavening in their tortillas where we have um, the production of gas for leavening from yeast. This is the most common leavening that's used. It's a relatively low amount compared to breads or even pizza for that matter. It's quite low, but it helps provide that puffing. So if you take a tortilla and you cut it in half, you can see it's kind of almost like two layers. Well, to help create that layer, that separation for the steam to expand, there's a little bit of yeast in there and gives it that fluffy texture. And it also adds to the flavor, giving it a lovely fermented aroma. This fermentation also often aids in shelf life preservation in terms of mold production, which we'll get to as well, because it produces lactic acid, which lowers the pH a little bit. The other leavening is, of course, baking powder or baking soda, and also there the production of gas and a fluffy texture. Now, emulsifiers. This is something that are used in a lot of the commercial tortillas today because it enhances the texture. It's a fat-based emulsifier, and improves uniformity in the tortillas, so they all come out in a nice round shape. And then by that, it improves the extensibility and the softness of the tortilla, keeps them soft and flexible over a longer shelf life. Um, Most of us do not go to a local tortilla bakery who makes the tortillas fresh every day or even fresh to order the way this all started once upon a time. Today, we go into a store, they're in a plastic bag, packaged, they're going to have 14 to 21, and in some cases longer, 28 and 35 and 42 days of shelf life is what you often see. So we need that flexibility over time. Otherwise, what happens is the starch starts to retrograde and recrystallize, and then they get firm and crack and break. So it's important to have monodiglycerides there to retard that crystallization of the starches, right? And then there's also other reducers and relaxers, which soften the dough and improve the machinability. These might be amino acids like L-cysteine and other even different enzymes that are sometimes used, like inactivated yeast that help with that dough relaxing. So enzymes, yes, as I mentioned, alpha amylase, which help with the dough handling, improve the machinability, and enhance mixing tolerances, as well as the crumb structure, so that you get a nice even crumb with the even holes and not just too great big a bubble in the wrong places. Right? And fiber. Fiber is often used in a variety of different sources. Oat fiber that you can get, of course, from grain millers is a wonderful source of fiber. And this improves the nutritional profile and it also helps influence texture. So as health conscious consumers look to things, not just a whole wheat or a whole grain tortilla, but something that's been fortified with fiber to give that additional nutrition as far as fiber is related, all of the things that it's beneficial for. And it also helps in the tortilla and contributes there again towards flexibility and bending and so on, right? Of course, on the health side, it has an anti-inflammatory um, uh, properties, and it is anti-atherogenic, meaning that it helps with preventing arthritis or easing some of the challenges with arthritis, right? Acids. Acids are used in a variety of different ways of tortillas. These are for pH adjustment, as I touched on a little bit earlier. As I mentioned, fermentation can produce some lactic acids. Acidulants that are often used are things like acetic acid. If you've noticed, sometimes when you open a packaged tortilla, it smells a bit like vinegar. That's because sometimes they use vinegar in the dough. Another one that is very common these days is fumaric acid. This is really very helpful in lowering the pH, especially if you're going to use it in combination with something like propionates, because they like to be in a lower pH environment to be more effective at retarding mold, right? And this improves shelf life stability. And sodium aluminum phosphate is another one that's commonly used. Some of those, as well as monocalcium phosphate, which are often, of course, you're familiar with using as a chemical leavening system in baking powder. Sodium aluminum phosphate is in some areas becoming less popular because of the false assumption around the term aluminum, that people think that there's somehow aluminum foil in it or something, but these are different chemical constituents, and they do not cause brain damage or anything else like that. Um, but ideally, you want to get below a pH of 5.5. I usually like to shoot for 5 to 4.8 if possible. And that gives you a really good environment for longer shelf life. And so mold inhibitors, as I mentioned, propionates, but also sorbic acids and sorbates are really perfect for tortillas, right? And they are generally recognized and very safe for usage in food products. They control the mold. Now, nothing is going to outright completely stop mold entirely unless you were to spray it with Lysol, which we don't want to do, okay? We don't want to ingest Lysol. That's not a good thing. So it's commonly used are sorbic acids and propionates. These are safe in food and they will control mold growth. That means they retard it. They help prevent it and give it an unhospitable environment. It's very label friendly. If you want to go real label friendly, we can look at things like cultured wheat, cultured dextrose, raisin juice, and rowan berry extract. These are all things that are friendly to label in terms of clean label to get similar types of performance in terms of controlling your mold growth. So processing tortillas. Scaling, we start off, of course, with the scaling and metering of invents. So scaling, weighing them, metering. A lot of water systems are metered these days. So you're metering out by volume, which normally that's equivalent to 1 liter of water is 1 kilo. Then, of course, we're mixing the dough. Sometimes there is a short rest, but most commonly not. With tortillas, we go from mixing right into dividing and rounding, and then a short rest. Then we get different things. So we'll start with sheeting, stretching, or hot pressing. Hot pressing is the most common commercial production these days. The final cooking, and then cooling and packaging. Cooling and packaging are critical. If they are not cooled and packaged in a good environment, like a nicely sealed bag, you will accelerate the mold growth because if they're not cool enough, steam will be rising off of the tortilla and condensate, and it will then give the mold plenty of moisture to grow. So let's talk about the pressing hot press. As I mentioned, the pros, the hot press flour tortillas, they're smoother on the surface and they're more elastic because you're gelatinizing some of the starches already as you press them. And so they are more resistant to tearing and cracking. And as I mentioned, they account for more than 90% of the retail market. The cons is they require a more relaxed dough. Thus, they may need more dough conditioners. When you're not using a lot of dough conditioners, the dough pieces after dividing and rounding usually need to rest for at least 15 minutes before they can be put through the press. So a die cut. So our tortilla die cut is extruded and essentially like it's sheeted between zero point 0.5 and 2.5 millimeters, and it is cut into individual round pieces. The die cut method greatly reduces the cost of producing tortillas due to its high throughput. Um, the cons are the wraps may shrink if the dough is too elastic. The cutter may be designed to be slightly oblong to compensate for the shrinkage after cutting. In other words, rather than using a round cutter, it's going to be like an oval cutter, already compensating for the fact that through the extrusion, the dough has been stretched in one direction, that when you cut it with this oval cutter, as it pulls back, they end up being round afterwards, right? That's the thing is so, but not always as perfect. But with the press, it isn't always as perfectly round either, right? Um, so that covers those methods. So QC for tortilla. Um, Different things is first of all, the physical is to look at the pH adjustment, water absorption, starch damage, stickiness, and rollability. These are the physical things you'll see in the processing in many ways, right? On the visual, you can see, of course, as we talked about, the diameter, the size of it, whether it's oval and things like that, the color, nice toast points where it gets brown in the cooking process, and the stack height so that makes sure that are they fluffy enough inside so that they stack them up and will measure the stack of 10 tortillas and how high they are. The toast marks, as I mentioned, and then the pockets, that they have nice pockets. Different places will have different manners of testing some of these things. I've worked with some tortilla bakers who, quite frankly, they take a tortilla and they squish it in their hand and hold it for 5 or 10 seconds and let go, and they count and see how many cracks there are. That is their way of doing it. There are instruments that allow you to measure this more precisely, such as a texture analyzer. Another way that is done that I've seen more commonly is that you have a set diameter stainless steel rod. It's usually between 3/8 to half an inch, so it's about between 3 and 12 millimeters in diameter. And that you use that stainless steel roller and you roll up the tortillas onto the roller and hold it for 10 seconds, then let it unroll and count if there are any cracks. When they're fresh, of course, there are zero cracks, but over time, you're counting and hoping there are still zero or less than three, or whatever the standard that is that you create, right? So pH levels are checked often in a variety of ways. Of course, you can do the full method of taking a piece of the tortilla and pulverizing it into crumbs, then putting it into a solution with distilled water, draining that off, and measuring it with the pH meter to see what the pH is of that product. That'll give you a very precise pH, but that's not really necessary in our case. We want to be able to see, as long as we're somewhere between below 5.5 and getting close to 4.8, and that can be done with an indicator. And there are different solutions. Some of them turn a purplish color as they are more alkaline, and green as they are more acidic. And others, they will be yellow orange when they are basic, and they become yellow as they are more acidic, and they're fuchsia when they're more alkaline. And this is a simple stain that is sprayed onto the tortilla, and you give it a moment, and then you can see it right there, and you can take pictures of it for recording things and stuff. And it's a really good, quick indicator because it literally takes seconds. You keep a solution of it on hand, and it takes seconds, and you check. And one of BAKERpedia's sponsors, Innofos, they make a great indicator solutions for this as well. I like putting in a little extra plug for them there, right? And so then let's get into some of the problem solving. So, how can I improve softness of my tortillas? Our tortillas crack when stretched, and how can we prevent our tortillas from sticking? Well, you can find out all of these things in our pocket guide. So if you, again, as I mentioned earlier, you can go to www.bakerpedia.com and download the pocket guide, and you'll have that on hand on reference. And we want to, of course, say thank you to Ingredion, Grain Millers, Vantage Food, and KPM for sponsoring this BAKERview. And as I mentioned, there it is, the QR code again, right? So if you haven't already, take a shot of that QR code so that you can go and get your pocket guide and have it handy on your person anytime you need. So we will now take your questions. And if for some reason I'm unable to answer them, we want you to go to our Facebook group, the Baking Industry Professionals group on Facebook. If you're not already a member, go there, ask to be added, 3 simple questions, and you're in. And then we have thousands of people, I think it's around a little over 4,000 now, who can help with assisting, and we're bound to find another professional in there who has maybe dealt with your question and get an answer for you. That's a very good question. So people want to generally gravitate right away to something like rice flour, which is a good option. But it's just one part of the puzzle. So you have two main things that you need to replace. You need to replace the gluten in terms of all of its flexibility, and you need to replace the starches in terms of the wheat starch that is there. So rice flour does really well as replacing the wheat starch because the size of molecule, it doesn't leave you that chalky flavor that you'll get from rice starch and things like that. Potato starch can be helpful as well, but it tends to make things kind of pasty tasting and sticky. right? Um, and then in terms of helping with the elastic part of it, you're using a combination of things like chia seed flour. You can also use, in addition to that, for some of the shortness, you can use things like almond flours. If you can get oat in a gluten-free standard. You can, and I believe Grain Millers does have gluten-free oats available. That is also helpful, oat flour, in terms of building all those structures. Sorghum is another great one because sorghum has also, like chia, a little bit of these gluten-like characteristics. So those are the types of things that I would use for a gluten-free flour replacement. And so it is really not a matter of just one single silver bullet. You want to find the right combination and create yourself a blend of what works well for you in terms of giving you the processing, the texture, and the nutrition profile that you're looking for in your tortilla. The most common problem for that is that they are underbaked. They have not been cooked long enough. It could be that the press is too cold, or that they simply, in the final cook, that they are not cooked long enough on the griddle. What makes them opaque is fully cooking all of the starches. It basically means you have uncooked starches and free water that is making them translucent. Very similar again. The advantage with keto is that you can include some gluten. You can actually add vital wheat gluten to help give you some of that gluten structure, and focus on replacing the starches as those are the carbs, and add things like oat fiber, which helps give you also a somewhat glutinous texture too, because of um, the stuff that's good for you in oat fiber. I forgot the name all of a sudden. You see, I'm human. This is live, right? And but that those are the things that would help you a lot because the objective with keto is to get the carbs down, and increasing fiber is beneficial because those do not go into your bloodstream as carbohydrates, and so that is those types of things. So if you the more fiber you add, you may need to add some vital wheat gluten to help you with this with the texture. Chia is a great one. That's one of my favorites. And of course, oat fiber is really, really helpful, right? And the beta glucan is very, very beneficial for you. Yeah, and I should have mentioned earlier that, egg protein, like egg whites, is very beneficial, as well as in gluten-free, as part of the gum replacement system. They just tend to be very expensive. And also, as this question alludes to, is that a lot of people who are following gluten-free or people who are following keto are often also vegan or vegetarian or things, and basically want to eliminate eggs as well. The best way is, first of all, checking your process. The first thing you do is making sure after the baking process that the tortillas are being handled correctly. In other words, that there's always clean gloves, right? And that the environment that you're producing them in, that you don't have a lot of mold spores in the air, so that it's a, not a clean room like handling computer chips, but that it's just that you don't have fans blowing dirty air around. And if you've done everything you can control there, making sure that the tortillas have cooled enough before packaging. And so, because where we want to start with, why we start with that is that just keeping in mind that when the tortillas come out of the press and off the griddle, they have been cooked. You have killed off all of the bacteria that may or may not have been there. So all of the bacteria contamination happens after baking, right? And there's always going to be some. It's not like we can make things in a sterile environment, but we need to control as much as we can. So then from there is then it's looking at things like sorbates and propionates. What are more and more popular with clean label are cultured wheat flour and cultured dextrose, right? Um, the secret here, in the sense, is that the culturing of these ingredients produces propionates that don't need to be labeled as such. And so it is essentially your propionates are acids that help work together with no, sorry. Yes, they're an acid that work together with the lower pH to prevent mold growth, right? And so working with propionic acids can be very, very tricky because they're very powerful. That's why you see in baking that it's usually sold as propionate, because it's attached to a calcium molecule to make it much better to put it into the system and for measuring and so on. So if you're using cultured wheat flour or cultured dextrose, it's much easier to measure. It's produced naturally through a culturing and fermentation process, and it does an excellent job of controlling the bacteria growth without giving you a strong vinegar odor or things of that nature. Fumaric is another great one, and it's very fumaric. The real advantage to fumaric is that it's very, very neutral tasting, right? So you don't pick up these odors of vinegar and so on. That is the same type of phenomenon that would happen um, in sheeting and cutting. And that is that the dough has a lot of elasticity or strength. Now, the first thing to look at is, are you resting the dough balls enough before putting them through the press? If you are, then the flour you're using may be too strong. Or if you got the right kind of flour and you're resting the right amount, you may need to have a little more lubricity in the dough through the type of fats that you add, and or adding things like L-cysteine, which is an amino acid that helps reduce the strength of the gluten and give you more extensibility. Then it won't pull back. So because what's happening is you're putting so much energy and stress into the dough, so that energy gets put in so that when there's nothing else holding it back, it's like a rubber band, it'll start pulling back. So what we're trying to do is not allow that gluten to be a rubber band, so that once it's stretched out, it stays in place. There again is one of the things is, of course, ingredients is ensuring that you have enough fats in the dough, and or also an emulsifier like monodiglycerides. Alpha amylase will help there too, because it breaks down the starches a little bit so they don't recrystallize as easily. And if all of that is already in there and you're still having a lot of trouble with it, look at your cook time. Make sure that you aren't cooking too long or too hot, because that could be drying them out too much, and that causes flaking that is a bit like checking in crackers, right? Where it not only cracks on the edges, but it cracks in the center, and that's usually a sign of things being too hot or cooked too long. If you have any other questions that come up, please do go to the Baking Industry Professionals Facebook group. If you're not a member, signing up is easy. Just go to Facebook, look up Baking Industry Professionals, and then ask to join. There are 3 simple questions, and then you will be admitted to the group, and you can post your question. You can search for questions that have already been asked on tortillas and many, many other bakery products. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And this has been a great seminar. My name is Mark Florka. I'm Bakerpedia's Baked in Science podcast host. And thank you for attending this Bakerview on tortillas and wraps.